Hello friends, and welcome back to another video. If you are watching this video, it means we have successfully made it to 2024. And before we get too far into the year, I wanted to sort of wrap up how things went last year because I read 100 books in 2023. It was close, I'll be honest. I was really scared I was not going to do it. My goal on Goodreads was 75, and then I exceeded that, and then I thought, well, I'm already this far, I might as well continue. And I ended up reading 3 books on December 31st to try and get the goal, and I did it, and we're here now, and we're going to talk about it. Before we get too far into it, obviously, just don't compare your reading to my reading or my reading to anybody else's. We all read at different paces, we all read different things. I don't want to make anybody feel bad or make it seem like 100 is an ideal or a goal number or anything like that, because we all read differently. So beside me, I have all of my books, and we're just going to go through, we're going to talk about it. I'll tell you which ones I liked, which ones I didn't, which ones I would recommend to you. I think first I would just really quickly like to look through my story graph because they have a wrap-up of the year. I read 100 books this year with 35,640 pages. The longest book that I read was Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix at 895, and the shortest was Christmas with Louisa May Alcott at 64 pages. The most time spent at 54 days was The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which you will see when we talk about it. That was kind of when I was getting into a little bit of a slump. Middle of the year, things were not going so great. I really enjoyed that book, but it took me a long time to get through. 86% of the books that I read were fiction, 14% were nonfiction, and my average star rating for the year was 3.8. So I feel like we've got a pretty good selection. We've got some good books, we've got some bad books, we've got a lot of books that I don't rate. That was my book stack outside. There are a lot of books that I didn't give a star rating to just because they were nonfiction and it felt kind of weird to give them a rating, but that is another big victory because one of my goals was to read more nonfiction. It's gonna really annoy me that this plug is here the whole time, but you're gonna have to ignore it because I filled the rest of my wall with books. And I'm just gonna go through from the very first to the very last, and we're gonna talk about my thoughts. And if there are any specific star ratings or reviews that you want to see, I always link my story graph and my Goodreads because I know I tend to forget to mention the star ratings, and also I just don't like to because if my opinion changes over time, I don't want it captured in a video. Kind of a silly thing because the internet is forever, but I would prefer to just be able to change it on the website and not have people look back at these videos and think that I feel a certain way about a book even if my opinion changes. So the first book that I picked up from 2023 was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. I don't think I need to explain to you what this book is, but it filled a special place in my heart because at this time I wasn't in college. I have since enrolled and I'm now back to taking classes, but when I was reading this, I had been a year out of school. I was kind of feeling like that place had been taken away from me and I missed it because I really like school environments. So it was really comforting to go into this world and to kind of live through it with these characters. Fast-paced, easy start to the year. I wanted to kind of start with a project because in my head, I could read one project per month. So for example, starting off the year with Harry Potter, the entire series, and then the next month moving on to a book that was a larger collection of short stories, and then the next month maybe another series, and kind of every month having one thing that I focus on because Storygraph tracks your pages per month, and I wanted to have it all in one month, specifically because I have Agatha Christie short stories that are all bound up into one big book, and I wanted the page count to actually reflect when it was read. That was a terrible plan. I did not follow through with that at all, but that was the thought process. So obviously, the only natural next book would be Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. But then after that, I took a little bit of a break to finish up Verity by Colleen Hoover, which is a book that I bought July of 2022. I bought this with my partner. We both got matching copies because we were going to kind of annotate it and then talk through it together, but not necessarily because I like Colleen Hoover. I can't say that I'm a Colleen Hoover fan, but I thought it would be fun to read this book together and then annotate it and then laugh at each other's reactions because also this isn't like her typical writing. I did my part. I annotated through the whole thing with funny little comments that I don't even remember making. I do think it would be very funny to read through this again just to see my thoughts along the way, but I still can't say I'm the biggest Colleen Hoover fan, you know? It's fine for what it is, but not for me. Fourth book, more Harry Potter. Obviously, we don't support the author, but we can acknowledge that the writing, the storytelling is still pretty good. A couple decades later and people are still as big of fans as they were when it was coming out, so I can't say it's not done well. The fifth book that I read was The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, which this is what the movie Hellraiser is based on, is this book, and I prefer the movie. I feel like this was kind of boring. The text is very large and very intimidating. This author is kind of promoted as one of the darker artists, and he's so good at what he does and crafting these really terrible things, and it felt kind of boring. I feel like I've read a lot more graphic material. Not that this is like, well, no, yes, the goal of this is to be graphic, and I didn't feel disturbed. I didn't feel uncomfortable when I was reading it. It felt very tame. I was bored, okay? 2 books on Kindle I read were Ungifted and Super Gifted by something Gordon. I got it. I read Ungifted and Super Gifted by Gordon Corman. I gave them both 3-ish stars because they're fine for what they are, again, but they are for a younger audience, so it's not something I'm gonna really remember or look back at. The first one did come out in 2012, and it very much has that energy with like the kid who's a little bit different and maybe a little bit mentally ill, and you know the flavor of book that I'm talking about, I hope. I probably would have really enjoyed that book if I had read it maybe 5-10 years ago. Goblet of Fire, this is maybe the only one that I just remember on my own, just because it's the biggest one, not even because of anything that happens in the plot. I just always think of this cover because it was such a beast to have to carry this around. The Invention of Hugo Cabret by Brian Selznick, I feel like is the perfect book for people who are trying to escape reality for a little bit because it looks intimidating, but a lot of it is pictures. It very much reads like a movie. Even if you're somebody who's not that into books, I feel like this is really easy to fall into. The author and the stories that he writes are fairly inclusive, and they're just a good time. They do kind of have darker topics, darker themes. They do get a little bit sad, but that's how these things go. And at least it resolves nicely. Animal Farm by George Orwell, I read this because it's short and I thought it'd be kind of easy, even though it is a classic, so it's a little bit intimidating. The one thing I do remember is the image of pigs standing on 2 legs. I wish I was big brain enough to care more about this book, but I just don't really think I do. I care about it enough to say that I have read it, but not necessarily enough to talk about it going forward. Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, on the other hand, is one that I loved so much. Again, picked it up because it was short. I thought it'd be kind of easy, but I also thought it would connect with me in exactly the way I needed a book to in that moment. Because in this book, you're following a woman who works at a convenience store, but she's getting a little bit older and everybody's kind of pushing her to move on with her life, but she's content where she is, and I very much felt the same about where I was. And I knew I was gonna love this book. I knew I was gonna connect to this book. I didn't realize how much I was gonna connect to this book. Specifically, there's a part where she's talking about how her life outside of work kind of is all based on the timeline of her job. So for example, here's when the shift switches, or here's when this type of food needs to go out and this needs to be promoted at this time. Not because she is actively working or supporting the business, but just because that's her life. That's all she has. That's what she cares about. That's what she knows. And it's comforting to have something to base your day around. I love sitting here in my room, reading my little books, but I also love thinking about how when I'm doing that, the place that I work is currently doing this activity, or these people are coming in. I'm always thinking about that, and it was really comforting to see that in a book. The final book that I read in January, the 12th book of the year, was The Scotia Widows, which I don't have a copy of because we gave it away for Christmas. But it's a nonfiction book about a group of women who sued a coal company because their husbands died in an explosion, because coal mining is very dangerous and people don't really care. It's really hard to read a book like this and to comprehend that it's a real thing that is actively, like, currently happening. Not just that it did happen, but that people are still experiencing this and still dealing with everything that came after. This story is not from a long time ago, and that's a hard thing to think about. And that brings us into February, where I read 7 romance books in 7 days, I believe. First, I read Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. I was warned that it's a little bit disturbing going into it, and looking back, I can't really remember. All that I know is it's another story from a Japanese author about how the main character feels disconnected from the people around them, which is something that I really enjoy about Japanese literature. That is a very, very common theme, and I enjoy it every time I eat it up. And you do also get an unreliable narrator. I wrote that if you like Bunny or The Haunting of Hill House, you might like this one because you don't really know what the character is thinking versus what's actually happening. And then speed run through some romance books really fast, because let's be honest, I haven't thought about these books since I read them. The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood, 2.5 stars. I guess I can understand why some people like it if that's the trope that you're into, but it started off with her just getting on him, just deciding that she can invade his space, and I will never support that relationship because of it. If the Shoe Fits by Julie Murphy, 1.75 stars. Again, I can see why some people would like it, but it was just so boring. It's sort of a Cinderella retelling, but it's also sort of a reality TV show for dating, and it was just, I can appreciate that it was trying to be a little bit more body positive, but I just didn't care at all. The Cheat Sheet by Sarah Adams, genuinely, this was such a fun and funny little rom-com, which I didn't really think I'd be the type of person to like that, but for some reason this book really got to me. I think especially the fact that it's dual point of view and you get to see how much they both care for each other, and it's silly just enough to where the miscommunication is like, okay, we know it's gonna go somewhere, rather than, okay, this is tearing them apart and all I have to do is say 2 words. It just created a nice tension, and it was funny and it was enjoyable, and I think out of all of these romance books, it's probably my second favorite. Secretly Yours by Tessa Bailey, I read it because it was coming out, I believe, the day that I read it, but I gave it 2.25 stars. I'm not a fan of spicy books, and Tessa Bailey's books are very much that. So again, I can see why some people would like it, but I just had no interest because that's not at all what I enjoy reading. It felt like it was entirely based on their bodies and nothing to do with personal connection or anything with emotions or anything about caring about each other. They just literally saw each other like through a window and they're like, yep, this is the relationship we have. Once and For All by Sarah Dessen. I don't even want to talk about it. I gave this book 1 star. I don't know if I did for any other books this year. I didn't like it at all because a major plot point that disturbed the romance was and it didn't offer resources. And it didn't really need to happen, is the thing. It didn't really add anything to the story. It was just something to make things dramatic, and I hated it. And I'm so glad I haven't had to think about that book until now, and I hope I never have to think about it again. It made me so mad. I did not enjoy that book at all. That brings us to Love in Other Words, my favorite book out of all the romances that I read for that week or for this year. Just in general, my favorite romance that I've ever read. Love in Other Words by Christina Lauren. It's a split timeline, you're a decade apart, it's a second chance romance, you're trying to figure out what happened that caused them to break apart the first time, where they're now trying to get back together, but obviously they have to get over whatever this thing is. But it also talks a lot about grief, specifically after the death of a parent, and I think just emotionally, it is so mature. Not necessarily that the content is so mature, but the way that it handles situations and the way that the characters talk to each other, and you can see so clearly how much these characters love each other. And then Book Lovers by Emily Henry. It's another rom-com, and it's self-aware because the main characters are authors talking about books and reading a book, and it's all about books, right? Book lovers, we get it. A lot of people talk about it as enemies to lovers, which it just kind of isn't. I know a lot of people say that it can't be enemies to lovers unless it's something like a fantasy where you can genuinely be enemies, because if you're just kind of sarcastic towards each other, that's not enemies. You're literally just co-workers. I think the conversations are really witty. I think they bounce off of each other really nicely, but the pacing felt a little bit off. I feel like we skipped some times that we should have been with them, and then we were with them for moments that didn't matter because we had skipped those other times. I wrote that it's a story about grief and guilt and feeling like you have to prove something in order to be valid, and the ending lines are so good that they gave me chills. Unfortunately, thinking back, I cannot remember how that story ended or anything about it besides the fact that they are book lovers. And I feel like if I didn't know at least that much, we'd have a problem here. It was fine, you know? It was just another romance in the week of them. I still don't ever actively seek out romance books. It didn't change my mind. It didn't change my opinion at all about how I feel about romance books. I still just, they're just books, you know? They're good for an easy read, but it's not something I ever really reach towards. Ready Player One, I feel like my opinion was skewed because I had already seen the movie, and also I read a lot of reviews that said that the author is just really pretentious and kind of throwing his own experience out there as if this is the one way to experience things. I think the idea is cool. It did get a little bit boring for a while, and I do, again, think the movie kind of does it better. I wrote that the world building and the game descriptions are immersive, but the characters are just so overly confident and cocky that it can be hard to root for them, which maybe is intentional, but it just made it not a fun read at all. And then the final book of February was Order of the Phoenix, which, as we already mentioned, was the thickest book that I read this year. I'll be honest, I'm disappointed I didn't read a book over 1,000, but I guess we'll have to count this as a victory and move on. Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. I think every line in this book is crafted so beautifully, and I say the word crafted intentionally. I think it is just so gorgeous the way that this author went about telling the story. At some point, yes, it did completely go over my head and I kind of gave up. I just sort of let the pages happen, but I did still tab quite a bit. And I wrote, every single page makes my chest feel heavy. It is so overwhelmingly sad. Finally, the project that was supposed to get done in January, we're in March, but I wrapped up both of the final books of the Harry Potter series. I was happy that even after this long, the books don't feel repetitive, because every time you're getting into a new school year, it'll skip certain parts. So one year you're on the train, the next year they miss the train. One year they're at the opening ceremony, the next year. Like, you're always getting bits and pieces, but you never have to sit through the entire thing every single year, because that would suck. That would be so much for no reason. And I will admit, I gave Deathly Hallows a 5-star just because I think it wraps up everything in the series so well. And finishing the series kind of brought me full circle, where at the beginning I was missing school, and then I got to go through all of the years of school with them, and now it's kind of a full circle moment where they're leaving school and I was already out of it. And then shortly after finishing this book, I enrolled in college again, so it's kind of just this ongoing cycle for me. The next book that I read was Breasts and Eggs by Miko Kawakami. I've heard Jack Edwards talk a lot about this book, which is kind of the main and only reason that I picked it up. And I wrote that it's a raw and realistic story of how it feels to occupy space in the female body. The book is split up into two different sections. First, talking about how women will go out of their way to change their appearance in order to look more appealing to whatever society wants. And then the second part is focusing on specifically fertility. I thought it was pretty slow at times, but I do think that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It was just a thing. I wrote it's honest and intimate and occasionally disorienting, but it feels like you personally know these women. Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler is not at all what I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be a historical type of book. No, it's very much science fiction / end of the world, I think. I wasn't prepared for it because it's not what I thought I was going into, so I didn't really care about it when it was happening. In April, I did a video reading Maddie Healy's favorite books. One of them was Queer by William S. Burroughs. As with all of Maddie's books, they're fine. They're boring. It's a bunch of privileged white guys, isn't it? I didn't really care about any of the books. And then I had my reread of A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, and I decided to fully annotate it this time because I did read it last year, maybe 2 years ago? I don't even know. I read it a while ago and I really liked it, and I wanted to go back through and properly annotate it because I saw Destiny Sidwell do it. I've never gone this hard on annotations, and I just wanted to see what it was like to have a book that looked like this. To be able to so thoroughly say that yes, I did read this book. Trust me, I read it. I read all of these pages. I'm already planning on rereading it this year. Genuinely, it is such a comforting story. Obviously, check the trigger warnings. This is one of those books that is just so terrible. There's a lot of people saying there's trauma for the sake of trauma. We've already had this conversation. I don't need to say it again, but being a part of this group and getting to spend time with these characters meant so much to me. And it was really fun because I think it was this year, maybe in March of this year, we went to New York and I got to go to Lisbon Art Street, and that was just, I love this book a lot. Slouching Towards Bethlehem, this is my first Joan Didion. I think it was also for the Maddie Healy video, and I wish I had liked it more than I did. It's a collection of short stories or essays, I think, and I just didn't really care about a lot of them. Some of them were fine. I think they capture the time pretty well, which is what it's supposed to be doing. But I wrote the last essay, Being Young in New York City, hurt my brain with how much I feel it. As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zalfa Kato. I loved this book. I gave it 4.75 stars. I wish I had a physical copy because the cover is so gorgeous. It's very sad, but it's also very, very real. I think we all should read this book because it's an experience that not many people are aware of unless you're living through it. Obviously, with the news currently and how things are going in the world, it's kind of more relevant, I feel like. But also it's always relevant because these things are happening all the time. It's about war and devastation and people dying, and it's not so great, and it's very relevant, and we all should be aware of stories like this, especially if it's something that you have the privilege of not experiencing. I don't know if that sentence makes sense, but I'm sure you understand the sentiment. The Things We Don't See by Savannah Brown. This is a signed copy. I ordered it purely because of that. I had never read her writing before, but I've watched her on YouTube for quite a while, so I figured I'd give it a try. I will say her voice comes through pretty strong, but the writing was meh. Specifically, the story just didn't really hold my attention that much. Maybe that's because it's young adult, but it just felt like so many things were happening that didn't need to be happening. Like, I didn't really care about the plot at all. I think sometimes the writing was really cool, and it really had her voice that she normally has in her videos on YouTube, but paired with the plot where it was kind of a mystery and going and searching for this person who's gone, it didn't really make sense to me just because it's not what I was looking for. And I wrote that the ending ultimately was just kind of underwhelming, but it was fun while it lasted. Adelaide, another fine book. It's a story about an abusive relationship, so check the content warnings because it doesn't shy away from stuff that has to do with that. And I wrote that this book does what Colleen Hoover wanted to do, where there's abuse and love and trauma and all of these things, but it's handled in a much more sensitive way. And the characters have depth beyond just their physical attraction to each other. But I'll be honest, I haven't thought about this book since I read it. It didn't do anything to me. She's Sweet Home, nothing to say about it, just good brain melt material. It's literally just a cat living life, and it was good for what it was. I like to read these during reading challenges so that I can kind of give my brain a rest, and it does that, you know? It definitely rests the brain. I cannot find the fourth book anywhere. I've seen it maybe one time in my life, so I have not continued since then, and that's very frustrating to me because I try to finish series as soon as I start them. I'm not the type of person who will let a series go on, but this is now going into year 3, and I'm still not done. After reading Savannah's book, I wanted to get into more mysteries and thrillers, so I picked up The Silent Patient because that's one of the big internet books. Unreliable narrator, but I will say there were some plot holes that a lot of people have called out that I also did notice, and it kind of took away from the story a little bit because things just didn't make sense. Stuff like an item is banned in one place and then suddenly you have the item again even though nobody should be allowed to have the item, and it doesn't really explain how that person got the thing in. I did guess what was gonna happen like 30% through. I wrote the vibes are there, and I felt unsettled, and it's fun as long as you don't think about it too hard. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This is one of the highest rated books of 2022, so I knew I had to pick it up this year, and I love the diversity and the disability representation. I think this book is crafted really well for representing a lot of people. And also the entire book is just talking about video games and how it brings people together, and also these 2 or 3 main characters and how their lives all tie together. I felt like it was so slow. I felt like I was with these characters forever. I felt like by the time I had finished it, I was reading a completely different book just because I've gone through so much with them, but I felt so connected to their experience because so many of my real life connections have been formed through video games, where either I would meet the person and we would invite each other to play, or I mean almost every single time I hang out with my friends it's to play video games. So it just meant a lot to read a book where that mattered so much to them as well. Lived up to the hype for sure. The Marvels by Brian Selznick, again, kind of the same thing as Hugo Cabret. It reads like a movie, it's a fun time, easy to fly through, nothing more to say. Then I read The Housemaid and The Housemaid's Secret because, again, I was in this mystery thriller mood. I read them both very, very quickly. I want to say I read them both within 2 days. I think The Housemaid is a better version of Verity. They kind of have similar ideas with the plot, but The Housemaid does it a lot better. And then The Housemaid's Secret, I was a little bit scared that it was going to feel too repetitive, but I think it kind of takes a silly twist instead of forcing itself to be so serious. And I think that was probably the right way to approach doing this story because it is a very similar story to the first one, but I gave both of those 4 stars. I think they were pretty good for what they were. I read Happy Place by Emily Henry right when it came out. Fake Dating, Second Chance. A lot of people have said that this book is a lot more about the friendships than the romance itself, which I think holds up. A lot of this book is just talking about how all of these characters connect with each other, not necessarily just how the romance plays out. On the 1st of May, I read My Neighbor Totoro, which I feel like was just the perfect time to be reading this because they talk about May and I didn't realize that, and just the timing worked out really well. And it was the perfect day, it was a clear sky, it was just a good experience. I remember the experience more than actually reading the story, but sometimes that's the fun of reading a book. Just a feel-good book, something that I carry with me from my childhood. I love the story so much. Don't Look Now is a collection of spooky stories. Some of my favorites were The Birds and Blue Lenses, but a lot of the stories were a little bit boring or predictable, which I think is maybe because they're a little bit older, so they have since been done, but better. Or I've just seen these same ideas done so many times that even if it's not better, it's still just repetitive and kind of boring. On the Road by Jack Kerouac, I read it for the Maddie Healy video. I don't want to talk about this book. It's boring. I don't even know if I finished reading it. I kind of just put on an audiobook and zoned out. I didn't want to read this at all. If you like reading about a privileged white guy just traveling and having a fun time and doing whatever he wants, it does tell that story, but it's kind of insufferable if you think about anybody else's experience during the time. Under the Whispering Door, I hadn't heard anything about this when I bought it, but I had obviously heard about The House in the Cerulean Sea, so I thought I would try this purely because I just like the cover a lot more. It's lighthearted and it's cozy, but it also does touch on some darker topics, and I think it's a nice balance, and it did make me emotional, but it was also comforting. It has an older queer relationship, it has pretty diverse characters, and just big themes about life. One of my favorites of the year. In Cold Blood is a true crime story about a family that was murdered, and you're following the people that did it. There is no satisfaction when reading this book. Again, it just kind of sucks that this is a thing that happens in real life. This is a real story with real people and real events, and people did have to experience it. The book is fine, but the actual story itself sucks, because it sucks that people do that. I read a collection of classic Japanese folktales. I don't really have anything to say about that. It was kind of just to fill the time and also to read something that I normally wouldn't read. I haven't thought about any of them since then, but if I'm thinking about it now, the one thing I do remember is that jellyfish, I think, had their bones taken out as punishment. Love and Other Disasters by Anita Kelly. I was looking for some more queer books to go into June. Queer romance on a cooking show with some pretty great queer representation just because the author is non-binary, so is one of the main characters, so obviously it's a lot of personal experience. And it's fun. If you like watching cooking shows, if you like watching a little bit of love unfold on them, this is that. I read The Deal of a Lifetime. I believe it's Frederick Bachman. It's my first time reading one of his books, and yes, it is a Christmas book, but it's mid-May and I just wanted to give it a chance. I wanted to kind of get just a feel for the author to see if I would want to pick up any of his other books, and it was so sad. I wrote, I want to frame every single page. Final book of May, House in the Cerulean Sea. I don't think it was as good as Under the Whispering Door. It's kind of like a book that we'll talk about in a little bit, where the big thing kind of feels like a giant metaphor for racism. It feels like it was solved a little bit too easily, where they conquered this one beast and they're like, well, we're accepted now, and that was it. And it's fine for a fun little story like this, but if you are trying to talk about bigger themes, it came off a little bit weird. And there were a lot of characters to the point where I kind of just skipped over some of it because I didn't care about them. It was a lot. And that brings us to June, which is where things got very, very rough. I thought to myself that I could read 30 books in 30 days. I thought I could read a book every day in June because it's Pride Month and I wanted to support queer creators, and I thought it would be fun to shout out these books and to read these stories and to hear all the experiences, and I didn't plan it all ahead. And it was a really terrible experience because I was trying to force myself to read a book in one day, to also record the experience, and then to edit and upload. And I didn't have anything prepared beforehand, which means I had to read a book a day plus the video every single day, and there was no way to get ahead unless I were to read 2 books in one day. I had set myself up for failure, and so when I did fail, it sucked a lot. I was very disappointed, I was very discouraged, and at some point it shifted from discouraged about that to just not having a good rest of the year. We're trying our best to move out of it, and that's all you can do. Started off June with "And Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer," which is a really great title for a really great book. Again, absolutely devastating. It's a story about memories and having to say goodbye. I wish I owned a copy of this book. I might buy a copy of this book. All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. I read one of their other books and I knew I had to pick up this one at some point. It's banned in a lot of places, so if you are able to get your hands on this book, I highly, highly recommend it. This was definitely one of the top picks for the month. Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. I think the friendship in this matched Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, but the plot isn't something that was really memorable. I did relate to the characters a lot just because they are content creators, either making podcasts or making just videos online, and obviously that's what I do, so I felt like I kind of could relate to the characters and how they were feeling, wanting to be anonymous but also wanting to go and do this big thing. It was a little bit predictable, but I think it's more about the friendship that these characters have than the actual plot. Love That Story by Jonathan Van Ness is a memoir about one of the hosts of Queer Eye talking about his experiences and becoming more comfortable with his true self. I love how honest the author was about really intimate details of his life. I think we definitely need to hear more stories like this. That's kind of the whole point of what I was doing in June, is because queer voices are being silenced, especially in schools, especially in Florida where I live. Things are not going so great, so I wanted to provide more resources, and it just ended up backfiring for my personal life, but I just wanted to promote some of these stories to some of you guys who maybe otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to hear about them. One Last Stop by Casey and Quiston I was immediately put off because I heard that they did nasty stuff on the subway. It's true, they did. That kind of put me off the romance because don't do that. Girl Crush by Katie Heaney, I gave it 2.75 stars. Again, didn't really care about this one. I've heard that the author has said some maybe biphobic things, so that kind of put me off of the book, especially because it is focusing on a queer relationship, but it kind of just, it felt weird, you know? It didn't feel right. On the other hand, Felix Ever After by Case and Calendar, I highly recommend this one. I feel like it's a really accurate representation of this experience. It's enemies to lovers, it's closed door, obviously it's a queer romance. You're following Felix, who is trans. Again, dealing with intersectionality and race and gender and all these things. Rebellious and confident teenagers living in New York. It's kind of a very fun story because especially with how many people have moved to New York in the past couple of years, it was just fun to live through them for a while. It is a very specific experience that not many people are going to be able to relate to, but if you can relate to it in any aspect, then I think it could mean a lot to you. I Wish You All the Best by Mason Deaver. It's brutal. The main character has to face quite a bit of transphobia from their parents, and it is not fun to read. They're very aggressive, but I do think that this book captures kind of the young love that a lot of queer people have, where you slowly fall in love with your friends. The very natural progression where your friend group turns into relationships. I think it captures that energy very well. She Gets the Girl was very special because it is written by 2 ladies who are wives, I believe, and it is a lesbian romance, so obviously, again, it's kind of very much about their lives. It's a very, very slow build up to the relationship, and I don't know that I necessarily was rooting for the characters just because a lot of it was them trying to get with other people, and then it just kind of felt like a last resort of getting together. It was just, again, it was kind of weird, but by the ending I was brought back into the story. I did kind of want them to get together by the end. A Wild and Precious Life by Eddie Windsor. This is something I was recommended as just a historical queer book because I didn't really have that many nonfiction books that were specifically focused on history and not just one person, which, yes, this is a memoir. It's very much focused on one person, but it's one person who had a big impact on queer things at the time. I thought it was going to be a lot more focused on legal discussions, but it was very much just a story of her life, and I get so jealous when I'm reading about people who are going and discovering queer spaces because that's not something that I've had the pleasure of doing yet. Page Boy by Elliot Page. This is a non-linear story about coming out, but in the public eye, you're jumping through timelines. It doesn't shy away from harder discussions, so it is a little bit difficult to read at times, and sometimes the time skips can make it kind of confusing if you forget the different names of the different people that he's interacting with throughout his life. But the gender euphoria that is represented at the end of this book makes it all worth it. In July, I read Manhunt. This is a book about end of the world zombies, except the zombies are people with too much testosterone in their bodies, which is an interesting conversation when you're talking about trans people. If you're a trans guy and you stop taking testosterone, you might be safe, and if you're a trans woman, you're taking estrogen, you might be safe. It is incredibly gory and graphic, and somehow I was still bored. I think kind of the big thing is that it's really heavy on unpleasant sexual interactions, and the author has said some things about how she thinks there should be more of that in media, and that's a very strange take to have, and it was very uncomfortable to read because what does it add? Coming Out of the Coffin by D.A. Holmes, this was my first ever ARC. I had reached out, I said, hey, can I read this book before it comes out? And he said yes. A very exciting time for me because I had never done that before, but it's a queer romance story about a vampire. Not a romance, but more just him trying to figure out how to fit in. I think it was a pretty fun story. There's another one coming out this year, I guess. There's another one coming out sometime soon, so we'll see how the story progresses. Candyland, nothing to say about this. I read it for school. Obviously, it's an important story, but I am bored of school reading. Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. I love the way specifically that this author talks about the book, not even the book itself. Although I will say I think this book captures the trans experience that I wanted Manhunt to have. I'm just gonna read out what I wrote here because I think it captures exactly how I should be saying it. I'm very interested in the concept. I've never experienced a story like this before. It's a deep dive into relationship dynamics and personal identity while dealing with the pressure of parenthood in queer spaces. The writing feels sophisticated while still being personal, and it forces you to pay attention. Absolutely love how it challenges everything you think you know. Each unique situation deserves consideration. They're not good people, but they're real. One of the main things in this book is how trans women relate to divorced women. That's sort of a conversation that people aren't having. And the author talks about how this book isn't necessarily written for everybody. It's written for trans people or people who understand that experience. It's not trying to explain it to you. It's going beyond. It's saying, okay, we understand the basic trans experience. How can we evolve? How can we move past that discussion and go into deeper things? Rather than just talking about how it feels to be trans, how can that affect other things in your life? I read the Magnus Chase series. I think it was really nice to go back to my roots because this is something I read in 2015 when it was first coming out. So it was just comforting to go back to it. That brings us to August, where I read The End of White Christian America. Again, nothing to say about this. It was a school read. Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall is one that I highly recommend. I think everybody should read this book. I wrote it unapologetically shares the perspective that people choose not to consider in a way that is accessible and informative. Sometimes it's repetitive, but that makes sense for what it is because a lot of these issues are rooted in the same place. Technically, I read 99 books this year. I guess this is all a lie, because I reread one of these books. I read Love in Other Words again. I had to get a physical copy because I just needed to annotate it because I loved it so much the first time that I read it, and I didn't even realize that it was the same year. I read it twice, but I just loved it so much. I love the communication, I love the characters. Somebody's Daughter is a memoir about a woman whose father was incarcerated. You're following not just that dynamic, but also the dynamic that she has with the other people in her family and how they're all dealing with this. And it's an experience that is so different to mine that I didn't even really know how to talk about it, but I think the overall theme of just family sort of brings it together to where everybody can relate on some level. I wrote there are so many layers of pain and joy, and the author captures her experience in a way that shares pieces of that with the reader. It took almost 2 months, but I finished The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I loved this book. Again, I think it was one of those things that it was the perfect time in my life to be reading this book. At first I read it just to pass the time. We were waiting to go to a concert and I just needed something to do, so I bought a book and I picked it up and I started reading it. Even with whatever responsibilities I had, I was in school at the time, like I had things I needed to be doing. I didn't want to do anything else besides read this book. It immediately establishes why you should care about this character and what happened to her. And it was so easy to fall into the story. I didn't want to put it down. And then I think that stressed me out so much that I just couldn't pick it up. You pick up the right book at the right time, something that relates to your life, and it just happens to work out, and then it becomes a favorite book, not necessarily because the writing is good or the plot is good or the characters are exceptional, but just because it means something to you. And this book meant something to me. Finishing off another series, I read the last 2 Magnus Chase books. There might be more. I don't know. These are the last 2 I have, so they're the last 2. By the end of it, I wrote that most of what's happening feels rushed or repetitive. It was a little bit underwhelming, but it was comforting just to visit these characters again, and that's fine. I do think I enjoyed them more the first time, but also maybe that's not true because I don't even know if I finished the series the first time because I just thought it was kind of all the same. Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. I've literally been putting this book off for years, but I finally finished it. I was just very intimidated by this book because I felt like I needed to take something away from it, or I needed to learn something, which I'm sure I learned something, but I can also just read it. I can get an introduction to these ideas, and then if I want to go further, I can either look back at this book or I can get other books that relate to the topic. I don't have to become a master of the subject just because I read a book from somebody who maybe is. And I wrote that this book makes you feel dirty from the inside from how little you can do to fix the issues that are presented. Specifically, American history is so gross to learn about, especially because you don't know about it from school. They leave out so much information, so many terrible things that have happened. It took me 7 months to finish this book, but I do think it's worth it. I do think the time and the effort was worth it because this is a story worth reading. That brings us into September. The Wishing Game by Meg Schaefer, I don't really care about it. It's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but if all the kids were adults and if the prize was a single book, and also if Charlie wanted to adopt a child that he could not afford to take care of, and also if Charlie had a decades-long crush on one of the people who's hosting the... It was weird. I don't think the main character should have been in a relationship or had a romance with one of the people who's working with the book who she's looked up to for a very long time. I think that's a weird age gap. She knew him when she was a kid. Like, they met when she was a kid, so it's a weird relationship. I didn't root for it. I didn't like it. I didn't care about any of the adults because they're adults. The whole draw of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is that they're kids and something fun is happening to them and they're all kind of trash kids except for the one who's good. But in this, they're all just adults, which means they all kind of suck. My Sister's Keeper is a book that I read for school, just for family dynamics, looking at how these people interact with each other, but I will say the twist at the ending, it's such a betrayal. Dark Corners by Meg Golden. Somehow this is another book with another crime podcast. This is maybe the third or fourth one that I had read within a couple months, so I was getting pretty tired of it. My main issue is that this author doesn't know how to do cliffhangers where every chapter, instead of ending with, normally if you're doing a cliffhanger, you have a little piece of information that you can elaborate on at the start of the next section, but this one would stop just before it gives you the information, so I didn't care to find out because I had no clue what was happening. It wasn't like, oh, you're withholding information, so now I have to go seek it out and I want to know what's coming. It was, oh, you didn't tell me, so why should I bother continuing? It felt really disconnected and weird, and a lot of talk about social media, but from the adult perspective of, oh yeah, these are these influencers. Especially when that's such a big part of the book, it didn't feel good to read. It didn't feel right or accurate. The Family Condition by Cody Lakin, I currently have it loaned out to a friend. They think it's good. I think it was fine. It was another crime podcast, so that probably contributed to my dislike, but I think the actual peak, the actual reveal that happened, that it's supposed to be what you're building up to, I didn't even realize that it had happened until it was over. So that tells you how impactful this story was. Little Ghost by Greg Dunnett. I read this when we were on a plane going on a little adventure. Something to fill the time. I didn't really like it that much. One of the perspectives is from a ghost of a little girl who had bad things happen to her, and it just felt really insensitive and strange to have her perspective, as if you could ever narrate how it would feel to be in that situation. Gallant by V.E. Schwab. I picked this one up because of Addie LaRue. I wanted to try out some of her other books. It's another compelling premise, and I couldn't stop thinking about A Town Called Panic, if any of you know what that is. My eyes did glaze over the final battle a little bit. I kind of stopped caring, but it could just be because I read it over the course of 2 days, and I kind of forced myself to rush through it, so I just wanted it to be over. I feel like I probably would have cared about the story more if I had allowed myself more time to read it. The Stranger Upstairs, another Book of the Month book. I wrote, the writing isn't bad, but it isn't my style. I want to like it, but I don't know if I do. The characters are not good people, but I'll admit, I'm feeling a little bit spooked. I hate to admit it, but I'm invested. Looking back now, though, I don't remember what this book is about at all, not even a little bit, so maybe it wasn't as spooky as I wrote that it was. The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating is a book that I got for my brother for Christmas last year. I didn't even realize that this is some nonfiction book. This is a story about this woman's life. I didn't know that. But ultimately, this is a book that reminds you to just slow down. It's okay to exist. And I think sometimes we all need that. October, I was trying to pick some more spooky books, get in the mood for Halloween. War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It was fine. The writing is a little bit too old, a little bit too fancy for me, and also just alien stories. It just, again, it's kind of overdone. It's the same thing with Don't Look Now, where these books are old enough that enough people have done these stories now, you know? Like, I think at the time that it came out, it probably meant a lot more, and it was probably really impactful, but now I've seen so many stories. These ideas are so oversaturated. Tiny Nightmares is a collection of a lot of short stories of different authors, just tiny little scary stories that they all wrote. There are so many that there's probably going to be something for everybody in here. Most of them were underwhelming and kind of forgettable, which is fine with a book like this because you can move on to the next story so fast. It's very much something that's just going to sit there and somebody can pick it up and read one, and not something you're going to sit through and read all in one sitting, which is what I did. There were very few that I genuinely got spooked by. Finally got around to reading You, which I feel like the TV show does it better. I don't think I would have liked it as much if I was just reading the book, because he's kind of insufferable when you're reading it all from his perspective, which I know is kind of the point, but also I was reading it with his narration in my head, and that's what kind of helped it move along. If I was just reading this with my own brain narration, I don't think I could have done it. He's so boring and it's so like bordering on cringe, but if you're hearing it from the actor's voice, then it makes a little bit more sense. I think the show gives a little bit more context, whereas this is strictly from his perspective, and sometimes he's just kind of boring. Normal People by Sally Rooney is a book that I have been wanting for months, maybe years, but I told myself I wasn't allowed to buy it because I thought I would be the type of person to like Sally Rooney, and I didn't want to buy a Sally Rooney book and then read it and then find out that I didn't like it. So I sort of lived in this in-between of assuming that I would be a Sally Rooney fan while not ever having read any of her books. But I love books where it's just some people moving through life, because it's so nice to look at what they're doing and be like, well, that's me. I do that too. Even if they're not good people, and especially if they're not good people, you can relate to the little things that they do, and it doesn't mean that you want to, but you can see that these ideas and these actions have happened before, and it's comforting, even if it's not necessarily a good thing. I have not watched the TV show, but it has been strongly recommended to me, so maybe this year will be the year. I started off November with The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I read this on my Kindle, and it very much feels like The House in the Cerulean Sea, but witchy and also better. I cared about the characters more. I feel like the big plot was wrapped up a lot better. And also, this is how you do modern technology in a book without it feeling forced, where it is still a major part of the plot, but it didn't feel like a really old adult was writing about technology and kids these days. It didn't feel like that. It felt correct. It's a good balance of communication and development with humor, and I fully understand the hype. City of Ember is written for a younger audience, but Kaylin recommended it to me as just kind of a light read to get to the end of the year. It's dystopian, but without the gore and the graphic trauma of 2010's YA favorites like Maze Runner or Divergent or Hunger Games. And it was just a nice reminder to appreciate the world that we do have, because so much of this book is spent underground where they have barely any resources, and they are excited by the idea of a blue sky. And we are so fortunate that we get to look outside and see a blue sky. Like, this is the world that we live in. Shark Heart is another book that I rated very, very highly this year. I thought it was going to be a very, very quick transition of man to shark, and then it was kind of just gonna follow him. It is so much more than that. It is such a deeper conversation about humanity and what it means to be a person, and watching him transition from human to other. At what point does he stop being human? At what point do you have to let him go and say, okay, you're more animal than human, even though he still has aspects of both? You feel the love that these characters have for each other, and it sucks so bad to watch them going through this. The Sun and the Star by Rick Riordan. I read this one because I was a Percy Jackson kid, and this is one of the newer books, and obviously Nico was my favorite. I think this book was fine. There was a lot that went over my head just because I haven't read the actual series in so long, but it was still comforting to see these characters and to go to these places again. The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. I literally have a 90-minute video on my channel talking about this story. I don't think it was necessary for the Hunger Games. I don't think it added anything that was missing, but I do think it is a good addition to the story. That brings us to December. We have 12 books left. I started off December with Wayward by Amelia Hart. It very much felt like Fear Street with how you're following these different generations, but it's talking about the magic of nature and the power and the resilience of women. That's kind of a big thing. Some people had a problem with this book. I was looking at reviews. A lot of people had an issue with the fact that it's kind of just a lot of women being traumatized by men. I don't know. You can't read it that way. I can definitely understand where they're coming from. You're following 3 different women, 3 different generations. I love that each character you get is written from a different tense. So you have one who's third person past tense, one is third person present tense, and then one is first person and past tense. So you're getting all of these different times, all of these different experiences, some that have already happened, some that will continue to happen. Generations of women who are all struggling as a result of men, because that's the way things go, and it kind of sucks. And it is a little bit discouraging to read a book like this and to understand that that's just the way it is, but we can appreciate how strong women are for putting up with it. When I'm Dead by Hannah Morrissey. This is a story, a murder mystery, trying to figure out who did it. I didn't care about this book at all. I forced myself to read it because I was trying to finish Book of the Month books, but genuinely, I didn't like it. It didn't mean anything to me. I didn't care about what happened to any of the characters or why anything happened. I was so sick of reading this book. I just wanted it to be over. Fairy Tale by Stephen King. I've heard some people say that this is not his greatest work, and I would agree, even though I've only read 2. It is fairly standard as far as other world fairy tale type of books go. However, I did immediately connect with the main character, and I was rooting for him the whole time, and I think it was fine, just as a casual read. Not every book has to be the best one. I think it was okay. I know obviously some people have their standards really high for certain authors like this, but it's okay to just write a story and to put it out there. I wrote, it doesn't feel right to give it a rating because I feel like I lived the story with Charlie and we've been through so much. Charlie's the main character. I wrote that it's similar to It, talking about childhood fears and the gradual shift of gained power, how the main character goes from just being some casual guy to slowly understanding the forces around him more. It wasn't super entertaining. It was kind of predictable at times, but it was fun while it lasted, and that's kind of all that mattered to me. My Dark Vanessa is a book that I have had for a couple of years at this point, and I wanted to read it paired with Lolita so I could make a video talking about the two of them because it's the same situation from different perspectives, but it just wasn't happening. So I put Lolita down, and I picked up My Dark Vanessa because I felt like this one was maybe going to be a little bit more approachable, and it was, even though at times it was really gross to read because you're reading about an adult man preying on a young girl. And it's just talking about the very fine line that a victim walks to cope with what happened, because the character does not want to consider herself a victim. She doesn't want to acknowledge the things that have happened to her. I think this line kind of captures the feeling. It says, somehow I sensed what was coming for me even then. Really though, what girl doesn't? It looms over you, the threat of violence. They drill the danger into your head until it starts to feel inevitable. You grow up wondering when it's finally going to happen. You get conditioned to believe that men doing terrible things is kind of just a thing that happens. It sucks. This is a really hard story to read, but I do think it's done very well. I read No Longer Human, which I don't think I would have gotten as much out of this book if I hadn't already read the version by Junji Ito where he illustrated the whole thing. The whole story kind of just ties back to how stressful it can be to be perceived by other people and how existence can feel very isolating. And it's a tough read for sure. It's very emotionally draining. At this point, I was very much trying to speed through the last couple books of the year. I was at 95. I really wanted to hit 100. So I picked up Christmas with Louisa May Alcott, which is something that I got for free from Barnes. Just for shopping during the holidays. It's less than 100 pages. It's literally just some Christmas stories about kids enjoying Christmas. I read it on Christmas Day, so the vibes were correct. But I have nothing to say about the story because there's barely any. Then there are two that I am very happy about reading because for my birthday, I gifted myself a box set of the Twilight series. So we have Twilight and New Moon. I knew I wanted to get into some comforting books to wrap up the year just because it's something familiar, it's something easy. I can probably speed through them a little bit if I need to. I felt like the pacing in Twilight was a little bit off, but maybe that's just because I already knew the story, I already knew where things were gonna go, so I was already looking forward to certain events. And then New Moon was just so boring because Edward's barely in it. There's 300 pages that are just Jacob, and he's fine. But there's no triangle because Bella never at any point decides that she's going to be with Jacob. She's always Team Edward, so it's presented as a triangle because I get that's what's popular. Like, that's what the whole thing was built off of. All the hype was about what team, what side, what person are you gonna pick. But there's never any time where that's actually playing out in the book. So to have 300 pages of just Jacob was very boring. The ending kind of does redeem itself though, because it's such a memorable ending of them flying literally all the way to Italy. 2 books left in the year. The first one is Closer Baby Closer by Savannah Brown. This is a collection of poems. I read her book, but I hadn't yet picked up any poetry, so I decided to pick this one, and a lot of it is, I guess when I bought this I didn't really think about, so much of it is about intimate relationships and also about being online. It's like about modern day, and I don't like any part of that. I don't like conversations about intimate relationships, and I also don't like conversations that surround technology, so this is very much not the type of book that I would enjoy. So most of it I did just kind of go over. I didn't really care about it. It's also kind of hard to walk the line between genuine good poetry and good spacing and stuff that actually means something versus just 2016 Instagram poetry, and I'm not good enough at reading poetry to tell when something is or isn't that. But also some of it is definitely intentional. It's supposed to be funny. It's not all supposed to be genuine, serious poetry, I hope. But then sometimes you come across something that is so devastating that it will shape the way that you think about the world forever. Specifically, in this book, Pigeon Poem. I can say with confidence that that poem ruined my day. But in a good way, not like the writing was so terrible that it threw off everything. It was like, the pigeons don't know how to sin. And then the final book of 2023 was the first book of Ouran High School Host Club. I've watched the show multiple times, but I've never had a physical version. I will say, there's a lot happening on the pages. It's very overwhelming. It moves very quickly, which makes sense. If I hadn't already watched the show, I would be very, very overwhelmed looking at this. I do not think I would understand any of what's happening, but I was reading this at 9 p.m. yesterday on the 31st, and I just needed to get one more book in to get my 100 goal, and we made it. 100 books. So out of these 100, I believe 13 were nonfiction. A lot of them were memoirs, which is very satisfying to me that I read over a 10th of these books being nonfiction. That was such a big goal that I had. I wanted to be more informed, and I feel like I actually followed through for once, which is nice. There are 6 books that I gave 5 stars this year. The first one being The Deathly Hallows, which we already talked about. It was just a great wrap-up to the series. Love and Other Words, which I loved so much that I had to read it twice. A Little Life, again, a reread, a classic, something we know and love. Under the Whispering Door, and Every Morning the Way Home Gets Longer and Longer, and The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. These books are not 5 stars because the writing was beautiful, or it was something that was completely life-changing. These are 5 stars because they related to me. I felt like I could connect with these characters, and so the books meant something to me. And that is every book I read in 2023. Going into the new year, I am going to change my video plans just a little bit. You may have noticed, like I already said, in December, I did not post as frequently as I usually would. The past couple of years, I've tried to do Vlogmas, and this year I very much did not. I did it for maybe a week, and then I just completely radio silent. The reason being, I am tired. In June, I wanted to post a video every day supporting queer authors, and I feel like ever since then, I've just had no desire to make videos because I couldn't keep up with that goal, and as a result of that, I wasn't doing any activities I actually enjoyed. I had stopped watching YouTube, I had stopped reading for fun, I had stopped doing literally anything else. If it wasn't work or videos, I just wasn't doing anything. It was just so constant that I lost all desire to do it. And that sort of shaped the last 6 months of the year where I was constantly trying to keep up. I was constantly trying to catch up. I felt so good the first half of the year. I felt like I was on a good schedule. I was making videos that I cared about. And then after June, I could just never get that feeling back. But I kept trying to make videos because that's what I do. And that's just no way to be, because this is supposed to be a hobby. I don't make any money from this. This is literally just a fun activity that I have. And it doesn't make sense to spend all of my free time doing a fun activity that isn't fun anymore. So I just stopped. I decided December is for me, and so I did that. And now we're in January, we're in the new year, and I'm probably just gonna stick to that. I made this video because I forced myself to read 100 books so that it could look good in the title. If I hadn't hit 100, I probably wouldn't have made this video at all, even though it's the one thing that I look forward to for the entire year. And now that I've made this video, I don't really have any ideas for what to do next. We're kind of just gonna play it by ear for a while. I might be a little bit more inactive on here because I don't know what I like anymore. I don't know what I do anymore. I used to like reading for a while, and then I made it a job. So I'm gonna take a step back from that. I'm going to read for fun only if I want to read. I'm going to make videos only if I want to make videos. And aside from that, I have no clue what I do. So I'm going to take some time to figure out what I actually like as a person and not just as a creator, because I seem to equate all of my value to how much I can create, and that's no way to be. Happy 2024. I'll see you when I see you.